We all know the story by now. One of the strongest hunters, Issac Netero, met his demise when he came face to face with the ultimate life form and the king of the Chimera Ants, Meruem. And it wasn't for lack of trying. You see, Meruem was a force the world hadn't seen in likely hundreds of years, and from the very moment he was born, he stood at the absolute peak of the food chain. His physical strength was overwhelming, casually tearing through seasoned nen users and overpowering opponents that should have been untouchable. His body was even more absurd. Netero's countless Bodhisattva strikes barely managed to leave scratches, and even a devastating zero hand couldn't do more than wound him. It ultimately took the poor man's rose, essentially a miniature nuke, just to bring him to the brink of death. But if Meruem was only a walking tank, Netero might have actually stood a chance. What made him truly terrifying was everything else. His intellect bordered on supernatural. Within hours of being born, he mastered complex strategy games well enough to dismantle world champions, and that same analytical genius carried directly into combat. Every strike, every rhythm, every subconscious habit was just another piece of information, while anyone else would have been overwhelmed by the relentless assault of the Guanyin Bodhisattva. Meruem treated it like a puzzle. He memorized the attack pattern, made up hundreds of thousands of combinations, discovered the microscopic biases hidden within Netero's decisions, and exploited a single opening that let him end the fight. That's what separated Meruem from most other powerhouses in fiction. His strength won the exchanges, but his battle IQ won the battle. So what if we took Netero out of the equation? What if instead of him, we pulled in some of the strongest characters from other universes who occupy a similar role in their own stories? Could Meruem still defeat them with a set of skills, or would his reign finally come to an end? Against Satoru Gojo, Meruem immediately runs into a wall that can't be solved through adaptation alone. Gojo's infinity is not a defensive technique in the traditional sense. It's a conceptual barrier that prevents anything from ever reaching him by infinitely slowing down objects before they make contact. No matter how fast or powerful Meruem becomes, he cannot physically touch Gojo. This removes his primary method of learning through direct exchanges. However, Meruem is not hopeless. In the early stages, his speed and durability are high enough that he could likely avoid or endure most of Gojo's standard attacks. He would spend most of his time analyzing Gojo's behavior, attempting to identify patterns or limits. The issue is that Infinity does not have an exploitable rhythm in the same way Netero's attacks did. Even if Meruem understands how it works conceptually, he lacks a mechanism within Nen to bypass it. Over time, Gojo, who's highly intelligent in his own right, would recognize that Meruem is attempting to adapt. At that point, Gojo will likely deploy Unlimited Void. This floods the target with infinite information, effectively immobilizing them. Meruem, despite his intelligence, has no resistance to that kind of mental overload, and he would be rendered unable to act. From there, Gojo would finish the fight with Hollow Purple, an attack with destructive power comparable or exceeding the Rose. Given that Meruem barely survived the Rose, a direct hit from Hollow Purple will likely be fatal. Even if Meruem learns Gojo's rhythm, Infinity remains an unstoppable obstacle that he cannot overcome. Ryomen Sukuna presents a very different kind of challenge. Unlike Gojo, Sukuna is not untouchable, which means Meruem can engage him directly and begin his usual process of adaptation. Sukuna's slashes, however, are invisible and extremely precise, capable of cutting through targets with ease. Initially, these would pose a serious threat to Meruem, especially Cleave, but his durability is high enough to survive multiple hits. As the fight progresses, Meruem will begin analyzing the timing, spacing, and direction of Sukuna's attacks, gradually learning to anticipate them. This is where the battle becomes a clash of intellect. I would say Sukuna's battle IQ is on par with, and arguably exceeds, Meruem's. He is highly perceptive and extremely adaptable. It will not take long for Sukuna to realize that Meruem is learning his patterns. Unlike Netero, Sukuna would not continue fighting in the same predictable manner. Once he understands this, he'll deliberately change his approach, alter the rhythm of his attacks, or introduce new techniques to disrupt Meruem's adaptation process. The biggest variable here is Sukuna's personality. If he chooses to toy with Meruem, he risks giving him the time needed to understand his curse technique more deeply. However, if Sukuna feels genuine pressure, he will not hesitate to use a domain expansion. This domain guarantees his slashes hit everything within its range, removing the possibility of dodging or predicting them. Meruem has no counter to a guaranteed hit domain, and his durability, while immense, will eventually be overwhelmed by the relentless barrage. In a prolonged fight, Sukuna's adaptability, combined with his domain, would give him the edge. Reinhardt of Anistrea is definitely the most unfair. He is essentially backed by the system that actively adjusts itself to ensure he wins. The most important thing to understand is that Reinhardt does not even have a fixed set of abilities. He can gain new divine protections in response to a situation, and the world grants it to him, sometimes creating new ones if needed. This means that unlike Netero, who has a fixed ability that Meruem could eventually solve, Reinhardt is constantly evolving mid-fight in a way that's not even pattern-based. At the start of the fight, Meruem would approach Reinhardt the same way he approached Netero, testing him with repeated exchanges, trying to read timing, movement, and openings. However, Reinhardt doesn't have a rhythm to learn. He is always gaining new skills in response to whatever the opponent does. They layer things like first sight and second sight, which allow Reinhardt to instinctively react to new attacks from opponents. This directly counters Meruem's adaptation. Both are adapting, while Reinhardt is doing it passively and instantly, without needing trial and error. The biggest turning point comes when Meruem realizes that even if he does land a lethal blow, it doesn't matter. Reinhardt has the divine protection of the Phoenix, allowing him to resurrect after death. He can simply gain another version of that protection afterward. This completely breaks Meruem's win condition. His entire strategy evolves around eventually finding the decisive move. But here, that move doesn't end the fight. At that point, Meruem will likely attempt to understand the system itself, rather than the individual. He would recognize that Reinhardt is being supported by an external force that continuously grants advantages. Wonder Review from Jojolian is perhaps the most absolute counter to Meruem's entire philosophy of combat. Its ability, Calamity, automatically inflicts misfortune on anyone who attempts to pursue or attack it. This is not an attack that can be dodged or predicted. It's a fundamental rule of reality within its range. If Meruem tries to approach, he is punished. If he tries to analyze, he is punished. Unlike Netero's attacks, which had a pattern that could be learned, Calamity has no consistent structure that Meruem will exploit. It simply ensures the hostile intent leads to negative outcomes. This creates an unwinnable situation. His intelligence, which normally allows him to find solutions, becomes irrelevant because there is no solution to find. The more he attempts to overcome the ability, the more it works against him. In this case, Meruem is not outmatched physically or intellectually, but fundamentally outmatched by a power that exists outside the rules he relies on. However, that very scenario is why Meruem would meet his end, as he is the type to want to overcome any challenge, no matter how impossible it seems. It's part of his pride as a king. Gilgamesh represents one of the most dangerous types of opponents, not because he's purely overwhelming in raw physical stats, but because of how his abilities interact with Meruem's entire approach to combat. Where Meruem thrives on adaptation and gradually solving his opponent, Gilgamesh fights in a way that can either shut off that process immediately, or depending on his attitude, accidentally give Meruem the time he needs to evolve. At the core of Gilgamesh's power is the Gates of Babylon, a treasury containing countless legendary weapons, many of which possess unique effects rather than raw destructive power. These weapons are fired as projectiles at high speeds, often from multiple angles, simultaneously, creating an overwhelming barrage. For Meruem, the early phase of this fight will look similar to his encounter with Netero. In one key way, he'd initially be on the defensive, observing rather than attacking. His speed and reaction time are high enough they could dodge or deflect a large portion of these projectiles, at least at the beginning. More importantly, Meruem will begin analyzing the timing, spacing, and trajectory patterns of the weapons. However, unlike Netero, the Gates of Babylon is not fixed. Gilgamesh can vary the number, type, speed, and angle of his weapons at will. This means while Meruem can begin identifying the patterns in smaller barrages, those patterns can be completely changed the moment Gilgamesh decides to escalate. The fight then hinges heavily on Gilgamesh's personality. Gilgamesh is notoriously arrogant and often underestimates his opponents, especially those he does not initially view as worthy. If he treats Meruem as insignificant, he's likely to rely on basic weapon barrages rather than immediately using his most dangerous tools. This is where Meruem becomes extremely dangerous. Given enough time, Meruem will begin optimizing his movements, reducing wasted motion, and finding increasingly efficient ways to navigate the barrage. He would start closing the distance, recognizing the long-range exchanges favor Gilgamesh heavily. As Meruem closes in, Gilgamesh will likely respond by increasing the density and lethality of his attacks. At this stage, Meruem will begin taking damage. Gilgamesh's arsenal is not purely based on raw force. Some weapons bypass durability through their effects, meaning Meruem cannot rely solely on tanking attacks the way he did against Netero. However, this is where Gilgamesh's most decisive advantage comes into play. Ea is not just another weapon, it's a conceptual attack that tears space itself, releasing an attack known as Enuma Elish. It does not follow conventional rules of durability or invasion. If Gilgamesh decides to use Ea seriously, the fight changes immediately. Ea's overwhelming, wide area destruction that can mimic the effects of the rose at a minimum. Ultimately, the outcome of this fight depends on one key factor: how serious Gilgamesh takes Meruem at the start. If Gilgamesh underestimates him and prolongs the fight, Meruem has a genuine chance of winning. However, if Gilgamesh recognizes Meruem as a threat and takes it seriously, the fight becomes heavily one-sided.